18-year-old Braxton Townsend was just starting his life, fresh out of high school, when he found himself living a dream he never imagined possible. Coming from a small town in Nevada, he had grown up with little access to luxury or big city thrills. But everything changed when he met Pat Braun, a 75-year-old millionaire known for her eccentric style and bold personality. Pat had recently transitioned to living as a woman, and their relationship quickly became the talk of the town. She brought Braxton into a world of designer clothes, high-end restaurants, and lavish parties, a lifestyle he'd only seen in movies. Their connection seemed unlikely, and many questioned how an 18-year-old could fit into the life of someone nearly 60 years his senior. Friends and family wondered what Braxton saw in Pat and what she saw in him. Yet, despite the age gap and the gossip, Braxton appeared captivated by this new life. He soon agreed to marry Pat, a decision that promised him the lifestyle he'd always wanted, but also tied him to a complicated relationship full of public attention and private doubts. Braxton's story seemed like a whirlwind of romance and luxury, but soon cracks began to show. With people close to him noticing his unease, what started as an adventure began to take a darker turn, one that would ultimately end in tragedy. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Braxton's excitement seemed to fade, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. Braxton Townsend grew up in a small, quiet town called Searchlight, Nevada. He came from modest means, and his world was simple, far removed from the glitz and glamour of big cities. Those who knew him described him as a young man with a laid-back attitude, a natural charm, and a drive to experience something more than what his hometown offered. He was like a lot of teenagers, curious, eager, and dreaming of a bigger life. Growing up, Braxton often talked about wanting to escape the ordinary and live in a world of excitement. He wanted to see the kind of luxury and adventure he'd only heard about. It wasn't that he disliked his roots, he just craved something beyond what he was used to. His friends and family recall that he was always looking for a way to break free, to explore, and to find a life that felt extraordinary. Meeting Pat Braun opened the door to that world, and to Braxton, it must have felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. He didn't hesitate to step into it, hoping it would be everything he had ever wanted. When Braxton first met Pat Braun, it was at an upscale charity event in Las Vegas. He was working as a waiter, serving tables in a room full of wealthy people, when Pat caught his eye. She was hard to miss, 75 years old, dressed in designer clothes, and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from years of living a bold, unapologetic life. Pat was a recently transitioned woman with a reputation for her extravagant lifestyle, and Braxton was immediately drawn to her world. For Pat, the connection with Braxton was instant as well. She saw something in him that went beyond his age or his background. Despite their differences, they clicked, each offering the other a glimpse into a life they hadn't known. Pat invited Braxton into her orbit, and before long they were spending time together regularly. For the first time, Braxton was experiencing a lifestyle he'd only dreamed about: high-end restaurants, designer outfits, and glamorous parties. This sudden shift felt like a new beginning for Braxton, a chance to step into the life he had always imagined. In many ways, meeting Pat was his ticket out of the ordinary, and he embraced it eagerly, perhaps without fully understanding what he was stepping into. Before long, Pat proposed to Braxton, and despite the considerable age gap, he accepted. To him, this engagement was more than just a commitment. It was an open door to a future filled with possibilities he'd never thought possible. Friends noticed how Braxton seemed thrilled about his new path, talking openly about his excitement for the life ahead. Their engagement became a hot topic among neighbors in Seven Hills, the upscale community where Pat lived. People had mixed reactions. Some questioned Braxton's motives, thinking he was only interested in Pat's wealth. Others admired Pat's boldness, marrying someone so much younger in pursuit of companionship and adventure. But whatever people thought, it didn't change the fact that Braxton was now a part of Pat's world. As their wedding day approached, Braxton was swept up in the whirlwind of planning and preparation. Pat spared no expense, pulling out all the stops for a high-profile event. The excitement was real, but there was also a hint of nervousness in Braxton's demeanor that his close friends began to notice. As the wedding day drew near, Braxton's friends started to sense that he wasn't entirely at ease. While he shared photos of his tuxedo fittings and spoke excitedly about the upcoming ceremony, there was something quieter beneath the surface. He seemed more withdrawn, as if he was carrying doubts that he didn't know how to express. In private conversations, Braxton confided to a few close friends about his second thoughts. He admitted feeling a weight he hadn't anticipated, a sense of responsibility and unease about marrying someone so much older and with such a powerful personality. Yet, he also felt indebted to Pat for introducing him to a lifestyle he'd always wanted. He pushed his doubts aside, determined to embrace the life he thought he was meant for, hoping that any uncertainties would fade with time. But as the big day approached, that unease grew, hinting at deeper reservations that he may not have fully acknowledged, even to himself. Then, just days after the wedding, Braxton vanished. At first, people thought he might have gone off on his own to clear his head or adjust to his new life. But when he didn't show up for days, his friends grew alarmed. The first person to sense something was seriously wrong was Maria, Pat's longtime housekeeper. While going about her daily routine in Pat's sprawling mansion, she noticed that Braxton's belongings hadn't been touched, and Pat seemed unusually distant. One morning, Maria picked up a strange smell coming from the kitchen sink. At first, she thought it was just food residue, but as she got closer, she felt an unsettling sense that something wasn't right. With growing concern, Maria called the police, explaining that she had a bad feeling about Braxton's sudden absence and what she had observed in the house. The quiet neighborhood of Seven Hills, usually calm and luxurious, suddenly became the scene of a police investigation. As detectives arrived, they began looking into what might have happened to the young groom who had vanished without a trace. When detectives entered Pat's home, they were immediately struck by the strange, lingering odor in the kitchen. They noticed faint stains near the sink, adding to the mystery of Braxton's disappearance. While it wasn't immediately clear what they were dealing with, something about the scene felt off. Forensic teams were called in, and they began carefully examining every inch of the kitchen. Detectives Mark Ellison and Tatiana Pruitt, seasoned officers with years of experience, took charge of the investigation. They noticed that, while most of the kitchen was spotless, the sink itself seemed suspiciously clean, as if someone had recently tried to scrub it thoroughly. The team used special tools to look deeper into the pipes and disposal system, uncovering signs that made them suspect something sinister had taken place. The once glamorous mansion, filled with signs of wealth and comfort, was now a crime scene. It was becoming clear that Braxton's disappearance was not just a case of someone leaving on their own terms, but potentially something far more disturbing. As the investigation continued, the detectives turned their focus to Pat Braun herself. Known around the neighborhood for her unique personality and eccentric lifestyle, Pat was often the center of attention. But now her usual confidence seemed to falter. She appeared tense and evasive, a stark contrast to the outgoing socialite neighbors we're used to seeing. Detectives Ellison and Pruitt decided it was time to bring her in for questioning. During the interview, Pat insisted she had nothing to do with Braxton's disappearance. She claimed their relationship had been misunderstood and that she only wanted to provide him with a better life. But as the detectives pressed her, she began to reveal hints of resentment, suggesting that Braxton may not have been as committed to the marriage as she had hoped. She hinted that he was more interested in her wealth than in her. Despite her insistence on her innocence, there was a coldness in Pat's tone, a bitterness that the detectives couldn't ignore. Her words hinted at a sense of ownership over Braxton, almost as if she saw him as a possession. It was a subtle but chilling detail that made the detectives question if there was more to her story than she was letting on. With suspicions mounting around Pat, detectives turned their attention to another person of interest. Robert "Bobby" Michelson, Pat's former financial advisor and longtime companion. Bobby had once been very close to Pat, both professionally and personally, before she cut ties with him after marrying Braxton. Detectives wondered if he held any grudges, especially given how abruptly Pat had ended their relationship to focus on her new marriage. When they brought Bobby in for questioning, he didn't hide his bitterness. He described Braxton as a gold digger, someone who he believed had taken advantage of Pat's wealth and affection. Bobby admitted he had tried warning Pat about Braxton, but she hadn't listened. He explained that Pat's choice to marry someone so much younger had left him hurt and resentful, even if he hadn't voiced it directly to her. Detectives noted his frustration, but Bobby insisted he had no involvement in Braxton's disappearance. He said his feelings toward Braxton were purely personal, not violent. Still, his anger over losing both his job and his connection with Pat gave detectives reason to consider him closely. With suspicions mounting around Pat, detectives turned their attention to another person of interest, Robert "Bobby" Michelson, Pat's former financial advisor and longtime companion. Bobby had once been very close to Pat, both professionally and personally, before she cut ties with him after marrying Braxton. Detectives wondered if he held any grudges, especially given how abruptly Pat had ended their relationship to focus on her new marriage. When they brought Bobby in for questioning, he didn't hide his bitterness. He described Braxton as a gold digger, someone who he believed had taken advantage of Pat's wealth and affection. Bobby admitted he had tried warning Pat about Braxton, but she hadn't listened. He explained that Pat's choice to marry someone so much younger had left him hurt and resentful, even if he hadn't voiced it directly to her. Detectives noted his frustration, but Bobby insisted he had no involvement in Braxton's disappearance. He said his feelings toward Braxton were purely personal, not violent. Still, his anger over losing both his jobs and his connection with Pat gave detectives reason to consider him closely. As the investigation intensified, detectives shifted their focus to another possible suspect, Deborah Horsley Braun, Pat's estranged daughter. At 50 years old, Deborah had kept her distance from her mother, often disapproving of Pat's lavish lifestyle and, more recently, her decision to transition. Deborah was known for her blunt personality, and friends described her as fiercely protective of the family's reputation. From the start, Deborah had openly criticized her mother's marriage to Braxton, seeing him as an opportunist looking to exploit Pat's wealth. When detectives questioned her, Deborah didn't hide her disdain for Braxton. She admitted to several heated confrontations with him, including one shortly before his disappearance. Deborah recalled how Braxton had flaunted his new lifestyle and made bold statements about securing his future with Pat's money. Although she expressed frustration, Deborah insisted she hadn't taken any action beyond warning her mother. Her strong disapproval and clear resentment made detectives consider her as a possible player in the escalating tension within Pat's household. They couldn't ignore the fact that Deborah had both the motive and the emotional charge to confront Braxton if she felt he was threatening her family's legacy. By late March, detectives felt they finally had enough evidence to confront Pat Braun directly about her role in Braxton's disappearance. The discovery of Braxton's journal, combined with forensic evidence from the kitchen, pointed to a grim conclusion. Detectives now believe Pat was responsible for the young groom's tragic end, motivated by betrayal and anger over Braxton's plan to leave her and take a share of her wealth. On March 29, police arrived at Pat's mansion with a warrant. When she opened the door, her usual confident demeanor wavered, replaced by a look of shock as officers placed her under arrest. As she was led out in handcuffs, neighbors gathered, stunned by the unfolding scene in their typically quiet, upscale community. For detectives, this arrest was the culmination of weeks of intense investigation. The pieces had finally fallen into place, pointing to Pat's calculated response to the perceived betrayal. Braxton's family was left devastated, but they found some solace knowing that Pat would now face justice for her actions. The arrest closed a dark chapter for them, though the emotional scars from this ordeal would remain. At Pat Braun's trial in early 2020, her defense team took an unusual approach, attempting to explain her actions by presenting what they called a transgender defense. Pat's attorney argued that her recent transition had led to intense psychological stress, making her emotionally vulnerable. They claimed this vulnerability, mixed with her fear of abandonment, drove her to act in a moment of heightened emotional turmoil. The prosecution, however, pushed back hard. They painted a picture of Pat as a possessive and controlling individual who carefully planned her actions. They highlighted Braxton's journal entries, the suspicious evidence in the kitchen, and Pat's attempts to conceal the crime. According to the prosecution, this was no impulsive act, it was a calculated response to Braxton's perceived betrayal. The jury wrestled with both sides. While some jurors sympathized with the defense's argument, others saw it as a distraction from the cold facts of the case. In the end, Pat was found guilty, but on a lesser charge of manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. She was sentenced to 15 years with a chance for parole after 8. The verdict left Braxton's family feeling that true justice had slipped away, as they mourned the loss of a young life cut short by a relationship that had spiraled fatally out of control. After the trial concluded, Pat began her sentence at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Las Vegas, a stark change from the life of luxury she once led. Her days were now defined by strict routines, far removed from the extravagant lifestyle she had enjoyed. Those close to her said she struggled with feelings of isolation and bitterness, grappling with the consequences of her actions and the loss of the world she once controlled. Meanwhile, Robert "Bobby" Michelson, Pat's former advisor and ex-lover, faced his own challenges. The trial's publicity had damaged his career, making it difficult for him to rebuild his reputation. Surprisingly, in the wake of the trial, Deborah Braun, Pat's estranged daughter, reached out to Bobby. Bonded by their shared resentment toward Pat and the tangled past they both endured, they formed a close connection. Eventually, this bond led to an unexpected romance, as both sought a sense of stability and healing after the chaos Pat's choices had brought into their lives. As the dust settled, each person touched by the tragedy struggled to move forward, haunted by the events that had forever changed them. For Braxton's family, Pat's sentence felt insufficient, a small comfort in the face of a young life cut short. Meanwhile, Pat was left to face her own reckoning, as the impact of her actions reverberated through the lives she had forever altered. Life in prison forced Pat Braun to confront a harsh new reality. Gone were the designer clothes and lavish gatherings. Now her days were marked by prison routines and solitude. Reports from inside indicated that Pat spent much of her time reflecting on the choices that had led her there. She joined various prison programs, perhaps in an effort to find purpose or redemption in her stark surroundings. Bobby Michelson and Deborah Braun, now building a life together, settled into a modest apartment in Henderson. Their relationship, forged in the shadow of Pat's downfall, offered them both a fresh start. While some friends and family viewed their bond with skepticism, Deborah remained firm in her decision, seeing Bobby as a way to move beyond the turmoil that had marked her relationship with her mother. Meanwhile, Braxton's family continued to mourn, carrying on with a sense of loss and a lingering feeling of injustice. The story of Pat, Braxton, Bobby, and Deborah left its mark on everyone involved, a reminder of how a quest for love, wealth, and validation spiraled into a series of tragic decisions that no one could undo. As time passed, Pat Braun settled into a quieter life behind bars, gradually fading from the public eye. She kept a low profile, focusing on activities within the prison walls, often volunteering to help other inmates adjust to life in confinement. Some who knew her said she became more introspective, though she rarely spoke openly about her crime or expressed regret for the events that had led her here. Outside, Bobby Michelson and Deborah Braun continued to build their lives, making peace with the shadows of their shared past. They maintained a small circle of friends and avoided conversations about Pat, choosing instead to focus on their future. For them, life with Pat was a closed chapter, one they were ready to leave behind. Braxton's family, however, found it harder to let go. The loss of their son and the circumstances surrounding his death remained an open wounds, a constant reminder of how quickly dreams can turn into tragedy. For them, the story didn't end with Pat's imprisonment or the passing years. It became part of their daily lives, a sorrow they would carry forward, hoping others might learn from the heartbreaking path their son's life had taken. As years went by, Pat's story continued to be a topic of discussion, though it faded from major headlines. Inside prison, Pat maintained a certain distance from the other inmates, immersing herself in books and often reflecting on the choices that had once put her in the center of a scandal. Occasionally, she participated in group counseling sessions, though those close to her in prison noted she rarely discussed Braxton or the events that led to her conviction. Outside, the memory of the case lingered, particularly in Henderson's Seven Hills community, where neighbors occasionally recalled the strange, tragic story of the young groom and his much older spouse. For them, it was a cautionary tale about how quickly fortunes and relationships could unravel in unexpected ways. Bobby and Deborah moved forward, building a quiet life far removed from the chaos of the past. Braxton's family, while forever grieving their loss, hoped that sharing their son's story might serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and misplaced trust. They continued to remember him as the bright, adventurous young man he was, cherishing his memory while acknowledging the difficult lessons his life and death had left behind. In the years following her imprisonment, Pat Braun seemed to disappear from the minds of many, becoming just another name in the files of Nevada's prison system. Occasionally, rumors would surface about her behavior behind bars, some saying she had mellowed, others that she still carried herself with a touch of the boldness she'd once been known for. But for most, Pat's story was a reminder of how quickly life could change and how extreme actions born from betrayal and resentment could forever alter lives. For Bobby Michelson and Deborah, the years brought a sense of stability. Their lives became defined less by Pat's actions and more by their own choices. They avoided the spotlight, focusing on ordinary routines and the hope of a peaceful future. Their bond, once rooted in shared resentment, had transformed into a partnership built on understanding and a mutual desire to move on. Braxton's family, however, continued to feel the weight of his absence. They held small gatherings each year in his memory, choosing to honor the young man he was rather than dwell on the tragedy that took him. Their hope was that by keeping his memory alive, they could find some solace, even as the scars from his untimely death remained a permanent part of their lives. The community, too, was left with lingering reflections, a story that, while concluded legally, continued to echo as a cautionary tale in the minds of those who remembered it. As time continued to pass, Pat's story drifted further from public memory, becoming a dark chapter that people rarely revisited. In prison, she maintained her routine, blending into the fabric of life behind bars. Occasionally, newer inmates would recognize her name, but to most, she was simply another figure among many. Those who had once known her in her glamorous days would scarcely recognize the quiet, reserved person she had become. For Bobby and Deborah, the years brought a sense of closure. They quietly marked milestones together, celebrating anniversaries and building a life based on simplicity and mutual respect, far removed from the turbulence Pat had brought into their world. They rarely spoke of the past, preferring to focus on what lay ahead and the life they had managed to carve out from the remnants of a painful history. Braxton's family continued their private remembrance of him, each year feeling both the ache of his absence and the resilience they had built to carry on. Friends and family who gathered in his honor shared stories that celebrated his dreams and ambitions, choosing to focus on the life he had lived rather than the tragedy that ended it. In their hearts, he remained forever young and full of potential, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing those we hold dear. With each passing year, the tragic events surrounding Pat, Braxton, Bobby, and Deborah settled into quiet memory, a story that faded from public view but left lasting marks on those directly involved. Pat remained in prison, her once vibrant life of luxury and social standing now a distant memory. To her fellow inmates, she was simply another prisoner, her past barely relevant in the rigid world behind bars. For Pat, life had become a series of small, predictable routines, a far cry from the opulence she once knew. Meanwhile, Bobby and Deborah found contentment in their unassuming life together, far from the glitz and drama that had once enveloped them. Their relationship, born out of shared pain and a complex history, evolved into a quiet companionship that provided stability. Together, they sought to leave the shadows of the past firmly behind, building a future based on understanding and resilience. As for Braxton's family, they continued to hold his memory close, keeping his spirit alive through small acts of remembrance. Each anniversary of his passing served as a moment to reflect on his life and the lessons his story had left behind. For them, his memory remained a powerful presence, a reminder of love, loss, and the hope that sharing his story might prevent others from experiencing similar heartbreak. The echoes of this tragedy lingered, quietly influencing those who remembered, reminding them of life's fragile, unpredictable nature.